Marilyn Monroe is remembered in a single flash. White dress, red lips, a smile that looks like it belongs to the world. But the deeper you look, the more that smile starts to feel like a mask, one built fast, worn hard, and finally cracked under the weight of fame. Because before the cameras ever crowned her an icon, she was already living a story that Hollywood could never fully rewrite. A childhood defined by instability, a hunger to be chosen, and a quiet fear that the moment the spotlight moved away, she would disappear with it. Here's the twist that turns her life into more than a tragedy or a legend. Marilyn didn't just become famous, she became a product, then tried to reclaim herself from the people who profited from her image. And every time she pushed back, the world acted like it was watching a scandal, not a human being. The headlines loved the fantasy, the industry loved the box it placed her in. But the real Marilyn, fragile, brilliant, ambitious, and exhausted, was always fighting for air inside a role she never got to step out of. Today, we're going to rebuild her full timeline from the beginning, the girl before the name, the transformation that made her unstoppable, the rise that rewired pop culture, and the controversies that still echo because they were never just gossip, they were power games. And when we reach the final stretch of her story, you'll see why the ending still feels unresolved, not because the world lacks theories, but because the clues were planted across her entire life, hiding in plain sight. Before we go any further, here's the map. Because Marilyn's story only makes sense when you watch the same pattern repeat, again and again, in different disguises. We're following 3 threads at the same time. First, the roots, the early life, family fractures, and the emotional hunger that shaped who she became long before anyone called her beautiful. Second, the rise, how a young woman with almost no stability learned to control a camera, then turned that skill into a career that changed Hollywood's idea of stardom. And third, the cost, the moments where fame stops being a dream and becomes a system. Studios, contracts, rumors, relationships, and a public that consumes a person like a character on a screen. The question driving this episode is simple, but brutal. Was Marilyn Monroe the most powerful woman in the room, or the most powerless? Because the same image that opened every door also became the cage everyone insisted she stay inside. And once we understand that, the scandals won't feel like random headlines. They'll feel inevitable, like the final chapters of a life that was always being written by someone else. Before she was Marilyn Monroe, she was a girl learning a dangerous lesson early. Love could vanish without warning, and stability could be taken away in a single day. She entered the world as Norma Jean, and almost immediately, her life began to move like a suitcase passed from hand to hand, never fully unpacked, never fully safe, always waiting for the next knock at the door. Her mother, Gladys, wasn't a villain in the fairy tale sense. She was a woman carrying her own storms, work, stress, and mental health struggles that made consistency impossible. The result wasn't one dramatic moment that broke Norma Jean. It was something quieter and more corrosive. A childhood where home didn't feel like a place you owned. It felt like a place you borrowed. And if you've ever grown up like that, you know what it does. It makes you hyper-aware of mood shifts, faces, footsteps. You learn to read rooms like survival depends on it. Because sometimes it does. Norma Jean spent years in foster care and guardianships, moving between environments that demanded different versions of her. In one house, you're the polite girl who stays out of the way. In another, you're the cheerful one who tries to be easy so you won't be sent away. When you're a child, you don't call it strategy. You call it being good. But what it really is performance. The earliest version of what the world would later demand from Marilyn. And somewhere inside that instability, another hunger grew, not for attention exactly, but for certainty, for a guarantee that someone would choose her and keep choosing her, that craving can shape a person's entire life. It can make love feel like rescue. It can make abandonment feel like proof you were never real to begin with. It can make applause feel like safety, because if everyone is looking at you, maybe nobody can forget you exist. As she got older, the world started giving her a different kind of feedback. People noticed her looks. Compliments came easier than protection. Admiration appeared faster than care. And that's a confusing thing for a young woman whose earliest memory of stability is basically none. Because you begin to realize, if beauty opens doors, maybe beauty can become your plan. Not vanity, strategy, Not confidence, survival. This is the part most biographies rush through, but it matters more than the glamorous chapters. Because Norma Jean's childhood didn't just create wounds, it created skills, the ability to adapt, the ability to charm, the ability to become what the moment demanded. And in Hollywood, that's not just useful, it's currency. By the time she was still very young, she made choices that looked like adulthood, but carried the weight of a child trying to anchor herself to something solid. And once that pattern is set, seeking safety through attachment, seeking identity through approval, Hollywood doesn't correct it. Hollywood amplifies it, because in the next chapter, she doesn't simply enter the spotlight, she learns how to manufacture it. Norma Jean didn't wake up one morning as Marilyn Monroe. She built Marilyn the way a person builds armor, piece by piece, deliberately, with a clear understanding of what the world rewards. In the beginning, the camera wasn't just a tool that captured her. It was a mirror that taught her who she could become. She learned angles, light, posture, timing, the tiny mechanics that turn a face into a phenomenon. And the more she studied that language, the more she realized something terrifying and empowering at once. If she could control how she was seen, she could control what she was worth. But Hollywood didn't offer transformation as freedom, it offered it as a contract. Studios and gatekeepers didn't want Norma Jean's complexity. They wanted a silhouette, a mood, a marketable fantasy that could fit on a poster. So the change wasn't only external, hair, styling, a name that sounded like a headline. The change was psychological. She learned how to enter a room as Marilyn, softer voice, slower rhythms, the kind of vulnerability that reads as innocent, and the kind of confidence that reads as dangerous, all at the same time. She made it look effortless, which is exactly what made it so powerful. And then the trap clicked shut. Because once the world pays for a version of you, it resents you for evolving. The blonde bombshell label didn't just describe her, it defined the boundaries of what she was allowed to be. If she was quiet, she was difficult. If she was serious, she was moody. If she demanded respect, she was ungrateful. Every emotion became a headline. Every mistake became a personality flaw. The same industry that sold her as a dream also trained itself to punish her for acting like a human being. This is where Marilyn becomes a paradox. The most visible woman in America and yet constantly misunderstood. The more famous she gets, the more she has to perform the idea of herself, smiling on cue, playing the role even when the camera is off, because the moment she stops, someone else writes the story for her. And in the next chapter, that performance doesn't just get her noticed. It gets her everything: fame, power, obsession, fast enough to feel like a miracle. Success didn't arrive from Marilyn like a gentle climb. It hit like a wave, sudden, loud, and impossible to stand against. One moment she was fighting to be taken seriously in rooms that treated her like decoration. The next, she was the room. Her face became shorthand for desire, her presence became a guarantee, and the camera, once her teacher, became her kingdom. Her breakthrough wasn't only about talent or beauty, it was about timing and symbolism. America was changing, Hollywood was selling fantasies at full volume, and Marilyn embodied something the industry could package instantly: softness with heat, innocence with danger, a sweetness that looked safe enough for the mainstream but provocative enough to feel thrilling. The public didn't just like her, they projected onto her. Men wanted her, women studied her, studios used her, and journalists treated her like she was both a goddess and a joke, sometimes in the same paragraph. The strange part is that Marilyn understood this better than almost anyone. She knew what her image did to people. She knew how to turn a glance into a headline, how to turn a pause into electricity. But she also wanted something deeper than being the dream. She wanted to be respected as an actor. She wanted control. She wanted to stop being treated like a lucky accident and start being treated like a professional who had built her own power. So even at her peak, the story starts splitting into two versions. On the surface, it looks like pure ascent. The roles get bigger, the press gets louder, the public worship becomes global. Marilyn is everywhere: photos, posters, gossip columns, conversations. Her name turns into a brand so strong it almost stops belonging to her. And every time she steps into a new spotlight, it feels like confirmation that she won, that the girl who was passed between homes has finally become unforgettable. But under the surface, the pressure begins to show, sometimes in ways that fans interpret as diva behavior, and insiders interpret as unreliable, when the truth is far more human. A body can only run on adrenaline for so long. A mind can only live inside a costume for so long. The more she's expected to be Marilyn at all times, the harder it becomes to find Norma Jean anywhere inside it. She starts to collide with the machinery that made her famous. Schedules that don't care about exhaustion, executives who don't care about emotional limits, a culture that wants her to be sexy and simple, never complex, never complicated, never in control. And that tension produces a feeling that's almost unbearable. The fear that the world doesn't love you, it loves the idea it bought, that if you stop performing, you'll be replaced. Marilyn's peak, then, isn't just a victory lap. It's a balancing act on a high wire, with millions watching. One wrong step, one rumor, one bad day, and the same public that crowns you can turn into a crowd with stones. And the next part is where that high wire starts to shake, because the cracks people call scandals weren't random. They were the collision between Marilyn, the product, and Marilyn, the person trying to reclaim her life. And Marilyn, despite her public softness, was quietly becoming something the system couldn't fully control. A woman who knew her value, knew her leverage, and wanted more than applause. That's when the story starts to shift from icon to problem, not because she changed, but because she began refusing to stay in the box. The first layer of scandal was the one the public consumed the fastest. The image scandal, the constant tug-of-war over what Marilyn really was. The industry sold her as a fantasy, then acted scandalized when people treated her like one. She was praised for being sexy, but mocked for being sexual. Admired for being playful, but dismissed as unintelligent. Every gesture was interpreted through a lens designed to flatten her into a type. The moment she showed seriousness, an opinion, a boundary, a demand, she was framed as unstable or difficult. This wasn't just sexism in the abstract. It was strategy. If you can convince the world a woman is a caricature, you never have to take her claims seriously. Then came the second layer, the career scandal, the kind that doesn't look glamorous but can destroy a reputation faster than any rumor. Stories about lateness, set delays, unprofessional behavior, these narratives spread because they're useful. A studio doesn't need to say, "We're exploiting her." It only needs to whisper, "She's hard to work with." Marilyn became famous enough to be expensive and powerful, and that made her inconvenient. When she pushed for better roles, better pay, creative respect, when she tried to step out of the bombshell lane, the pushback often arrived disguised as concern or industry gossip. The more she fought for control, the more the machine built a counterstory. Marilyn as chaos, Marilyn as a liability, Marilyn as the reason things go wrong. But the third layer is where everything turns darker, because it's where celebrity stops being entertainment and becomes a power game. The web of relationships, rumors, and private access that people treated like currency. Marilyn's private life became public property in real time, speculated on, judged, rewritten. Not just romance headlines, but the implication that proximity to powerful men explained her success. It's one of the oldest tricks in show business. If a woman becomes too iconic, reduce her to who she's dated, who she's seen with, who she's rumored to know. It doesn't matter how hard she worked. The rumor is simpler to sell than the truth. And the most exhausting part was that she couldn't win either way. If she stayed silent, the rumors grew. If she pushed back, she confirmed the story that she was dramatic. If she tried to live like a normal person, love someone, leave someone, make mistakes, those mistakes became myth. What makes Marilyn's scandals so sticky across generations is that they weren't just headlines. They were the visible symptoms of an invisible war, Marilyn trying to become an artist and a human being, while the world insisted she remain a fantasy. She wasn't only being watched. She was being managed by studios, by press narratives, by public obsession, by the expectations attached to her own face. And here's the turning point. When a star realizes the system is feeding on her, she has two options: break down or break free. Marilyn tried to break free, and that attempt is exactly where the emotional center of her story begins, because fame didn't just cost her privacy. It threatened to erase her identity. At the heart of Marilyn Monroe's story is a loneliness that fame couldn't touch, because fame for her wasn't love. It was noise. And when the noise finally faded at night, she was left with the same fear she'd carried since childhood, that the world could be full of eyes and still not truly see you. By this point, Marilyn had become a symbol so big it started swallowing the person inside it. The public believed they knew her because they recognized her face. Reporters believed they owned her because they could turn her worst day into a headline. Studios believed they controlled her because they could threaten to replace her. And even fans who adored her often loved the fantasy more than the truth. That is a strange kind of isolation, being surrounded by attention and still feeling emotionally invisible. She wanted to be taken seriously, not as a punchline, not as a costume, not as a type. She wanted to be respected for effort, intelligence, craft. But the more she reached for that, the more the world reacted like she was breaking an unspoken rule. Stay beautiful, stay soft, stay simple, stay grateful. When you're constantly rewarded for one version of yourself, you begin to wonder if the rest of you is unwanted. And that thought can become a trap. You keep performing because you're terrified the applause is conditional. This is where the story becomes painful in a way that can't be reduced to gossip. It isn't just about rumors or romances or the industry machine. It's about what happens when a person's identity is turned into a public product. When you're no longer allowed to have private emotions, because every emotion becomes a storyline someone else monetizes. When you begin to doubt whether you have a self outside the image. And if you look at her entire life through that lens, her most famous moments start to carry a different weight. The glamour becomes effort. The smile becomes endurance. The seduction becomes choreography. Marilyn wasn't only performing for the camera, she was performing to survive. Because for someone with her past, being wanted could feel like safety. But being wanted is not the same as being cared for, and eventually, the gap between those two things becomes impossible to ignore. The tragedy is that she was not weak. She was intensely determined. She tried repeatedly to steer her own story back toward something real, toward artistry, control, dignity, but the world around her moved faster than her healing. And the moment she couldn't keep up with the version of Marilyn everyone demanded, the same culture that worshipped her began to treat her pain like spectacle. And then, the timeline reaches its final stretch, where the headlines get louder, the questions multiply, and the ending becomes a doorway that people still stare into, hoping it will explain everything. As Marilyn's story moved into its final stretch, the world seemed to watch her with a different kind of intensity, less like admiration and more like possession. The timeline becomes dense with pressure, career expectations, constant scrutiny, and a public narrative that never stopped rewriting her into whatever was easiest to consume. Even without leaning into speculation, one thing is clear. By the end, she was living at the intersection of exhaustion and fame, where every private moment risks becoming public property. What follows is why her ending still feels unresolved to so many people, not because there aren't theories, but because her life had trained the world to treat her as a symbol instead of a person. When the final chapter arrived, it didn't land like a human tragedy. It landed like a cultural shock, instantly mythologized, instantly debated, instantly pulled into competing stories. And that's the cruelest part. For someone who fought so hard to be seen as real, even her last days were turned into a screen people projected onto, searching for meaning, blame, or a twist that could make the story feel complete. Marilyn Monroe didn't just leave behind movies and photographs. She left behind a blueprint for how modern fame works, how a person can be turned into an icon, and how that icon can outlive the human being who created it. Decades later, her image is still instantly recognizable, still quoted, still recreated, still sold, and that endurance is not accidental. Marilyn became the language of Hollywood glamour itself, soft lighting, red lips, a smile that promises warmth while hiding pain. But her real legacy is deeper than style. It's the tension she exposed, the gap between the woman the world demanded and the woman she was trying to become. Her story still matters because it keeps repeating in new faces. Artists celebrated for their beauty and punished for their complexity, adored in public while unraveling in private. Marilyn's life warns us that fame can be both a crown and a cage, and the most dangerous part is how easily the audience forgets there's a person inside the performance. In the end, Marilyn remains a paradox we can't stop staring at, the most visible woman of her era and one of the most misunderstood. And maybe that's why the story never feels finished, because the world is still learning the lesson she lived too early. Admiration is not protection, and being seen is not the same as being known.